The day the Galactic Council realized humans were not prey. The airlock behind me sealed with a sound like the universe holding its breath. I had exactly 4 seconds to decide whether I looked afraid. I chose not to. The corridor stretched ahead of me in a curve so long I could not see where it ended. The ceiling was 40 feet above my head, lit by panels of cold blue light that pulsed faintly, like something breathing. The walls were covered in a material I had no name for, dark and smooth and slightly warm to the touch. Everything about this place was designed to make a visitor feel small. My name is Cale Marin. I am 38 years old. I grew up in Yorkshire, England, in a house where the heating barely worked and the wind came in through the kitchen window every November. I have been cold before. I have felt small before. I walked forward. At the end of the corridor, a delegation was waiting for me. 12 figures. Tall, each one different, each one a representative of a different civilization that had been crossing the stars while my ancestors were still figuring out the wheel. The one at the center was called Vrethan. I had read everything about him before I left Earth. He was the chief elder of the Dal Collective, the most powerful political bloc in the Galactic Council. He was also, according to every intelligence briefing I had received, the one who had decided Earth needed to be brought into line before humanity became inconvenient. He looked at me the way a man looks at a bird that has flown into his house. Curious. Faintly annoyed. Already thinking about how to get it out. Ambassador Marin, he said. His voice came through a translation unit clipped to the collar of his robe, and it rendered his words in English with almost no accent. We expected a larger party. I work better alone, I said. That was not entirely true. But it was the message I needed them to receive. They led me through the station. I kept my eyes moving. Not nervously, not the way a tourist gapes at things. I watched the way a person watches when they are gathering information. I noted the number of personnel in each section. I noted the positioning of what I was fairly certain were sensor arrays built into the corridor walls. I noted the species present and matched them to the political profiles I had memorized over the previous 8 months. I counted the exits from each room we passed through. Old habit. My grandfather had been in the British Army. He always said the most useful thing he ever learned was to count exits. The assembly hall was enormous. Rows of curved seats rose in tiers around a central speaking floor, and from every tier, alien faces looked down at me. Hundreds of them. Maybe more. Some had eyes I recognized. Some had arrangements of sensory organs I had no framework for. All of them were watching the one human who had come to this station without a bodyguard, without a support staff, without anything except a briefcase and a very particular kind of patience. Vrethan guided me to a seat at the diplomatic table. It was lower than the council chairs. Deliberately lower. I sat down, set my briefcase on the floor beside me, and folded my hands on the table. A council aide placed a document in front of me. It was 40 pages long and written in Galactic Standard script, which I could read, because I had spent 3 years learning it before Earth was ever officially contacted. It was a tier classification document. It described Earth as a Tier 4 emerging species. I already knew what that meant. Tier 4 was the legal category that allowed other member civilizations to petition for resource rights, territorial management, and what the document delicately called civilizational integration assistance. In plain language, it was the framework they used to absorb smaller species into the larger ones. Vrethan watched me read it. I could feel his attention like a hand on my shoulder. We have assessed your world thoroughly, he said. Earth is rich in rare minerals, atmospheric diversity, and genetic variety. The Council has identified several member civilizations whose expansion requirements align well with what Earth can offer. I turned the page. There is also the matter of your species' instability, said another Council member. I did not look up to see who. Your history of internal conflict, your fluctuating political structures. These are risk factors for independent Tier 1 classification. I turned another page. We are prepared to offer Earth a managed integration pathway, Vrethan said. Your people would retain cultural preservation zones. Your language would be catalogued. Your unique biological traits would be protected under galactic heritage statutes. I reached the last page. I looked at the space at the bottom where my signature was supposed to go. I looked up at Vrethan. I have a few questions, I said. He smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the smile of someone who has already decided the outcome and is simply allowing the process to run its course. Of course. I opened my briefcase. I took out a notebook. An actual paper notebook, the kind with a hard cover and ruled lines. I had brought it deliberately. Every alien eye in the room found it. There was something about the object that seemed to confuse them. It was too simple. Too old. They could not read what it meant. It meant exactly what I wanted it to mean. It meant I was not worried enough about this meeting to need anything more sophisticated than paper. Your fleet response protocols, I said, clicking my pen. Specifically, the time delay between a council authorization order and actual fleet deployment in the outer sectors. Could you walk me through that process? Brethen blinked. The translation unit hummed. That is not a standard question for a classification review, he said. No, I agreed. It is not. I wrote something in my notebook. I did not show it to anyone. I am also curious about the membership disputes between the Verith Coalition and the Dal Collective, I said. Specifically regarding the disputed mining rights in Sector 41. How long has that been unresolved? The silence in the room changed quality. It became more careful. I wrote something else. Brethen's voice, when he spoke again, was slightly different. Not angry. Something more precise than angry. Ambassador Marin, perhaps we should redirect to the matter at hand. Of course, I said. I capped my pen. I smiled at him. I simply like to understand the room I am sitting in. He studied me for a long moment. I met his gaze and did not blink. He had dealt with hundreds of species in his career. He knew how fear looked. He knew how desperation looked. He knew how stubborn pride looked, and how ignorant confidence looked, and how desperate bluffing looked. He had a catalog of the ways a smaller civilization behaved when confronted with its own smallness. What he was looking at now, he did not have a category for. I was not afraid. I was not proud. I was not performing confidence. I was taking notes. We will resume formal proceedings in the morning, Brethen said. I nodded. I picked up my briefcase. I walked back down that long corridor, past the blue pulsing panels and the warm dark walls, and I felt every set of eyes in that station following me. They were trying to figure out what they had just seen. They were trying to decide whether my calmness was a shield or a door. They were already wrong. It was neither. It was a clock. I found my assigned quarters, sat down on the edge of the bed, and opened my notebook. I had written 11 things during that meeting. Each of them was a question. Not because I did not know the answers. Because I needed to know which answers they were going to lie about. I set the notebook on the nightstand, turned off the light, and went to sleep. I had been in colder rooms than this. The report was 47 pages long. Brethen read all of it before the second meal cycle. He read it standing at the window of his private office, looking out at the stars, because he had found long ago that bad news was easier to process when you had something beautiful to look at. Outside the window, the gas giant that anchored the station hung in space like a painting, its storm bands moving so slowly they seemed still. He read the first section and thought, so far, as expected. He read the second section and thought, this is interesting. He read the third section and set the report down. He poured himself a glass of Dathane, the only drink he allowed himself during working hours. He drank it slowly. Then he picked the report back up. By the fourth section, he had stopped thinking in words at all. The report had been compiled by the Council's Intelligence Division over the previous 2 years, following Earth's first radio-based contact with a DAL survey vessel. Standard procedure for a newly detected species. Survey their broadcasts, analyze their technological output, assess their military capacity, classify accordingly. The classification had come back, Tier 4. Negligible military threat. No energy shielding. No antimatter propulsion. No psionic network capability. Primitive chemical reaction propulsion systems. Internal political fragmentation making coordinated resistance statistically unlikely. Brethen had signed off on that classification without looking at it closely. He had dealt with hundreds of emerging species. They followed patterns. But now someone in the intelligence division, a junior analyst named Itho, had added a supplementary file. Itho had apparently spent the past several months going beyond the standard checklist. Reading history. Reading literature. Watching what the humans called films, thousands of hours of recorded human storytelling. Reading medical research. Reading what the humans called philosophy. Itho had flagged the supplementary file as priority 1, which was why it had eventually landed on Vrethen's desk. Vrethen read Itho's opening paragraph 3 times. It said, "The standard classification model does not account for the possibility that a species' most significant military asset is not any technology it possesses but the nature of the species itself." Vrethen turned to section 2. It detailed human history of internal conflict. Not to show that humans were unstable, which was the standard interpretation. Itho had reframed it entirely. The section argued that humanity's continuous history of fighting itself had functioned, over millennia, as an accelerated pressure chamber. Every generation that survived a major catastrophe had come out the other side having learned something, having built something, having adapted. The wars had been terrible. Itho did not soften that. But the point was not the wars themselves. The point was what came after. Humans rebuilt. Every time. Without exception. Vrethen read about something the humans called the Black Death. A disease that had removed between 1/3 and 1/2 of the human population of their primary continent within 4 years. He paused on that figure. He tried to imagine what that would mean for his own species. He concluded it would mean the end of the Dal collective as a functioning civilization. For humans, it had meant a century of difficulty followed by a period they called the Renaissance. A flowering of art, architecture, science, and philosophy so rapid it had reshaped their entire civilization. He read about the great wars of the 20th century. 2 of them within 30 years. The second one had killed somewhere between 70 and 85 million people. A figure that defied simple comprehension. And then within 50 years of that, humans had walked on their own moon. He read about the climate collapse of 2041. A self-inflicted catastrophe. The kind of thing that tended to mark the end of a species' independent development. The kind of event the Council had seen kill civilizations before they ever reached the stars. Humans had responded by rebuilding their energy infrastructure in 40 years. By reorganizing their agricultural systems. By losing hundreds of millions of people to floods, droughts, and displacement, and then planting trees. Not because it was efficient. Not because there was immediate benefit. Because planting trees was what you did when you believed there would be people alive to sit in their shade. Vrethen reached the section on human biology. He had read biological assessments before. They were usually straightforward. This one was not. The human body was, by galactic standards, remarkably ordinary. No remarkable sensory range. No natural armor. No venom. Moderate speed. Moderate strength. A lifespan that was short even by the standards of other Tier 4 species. And yet, Itho had flagged a specific biological trait, persistence. Not in the vague sense, but in the literal, physiological sense. Humans were one of only a handful of species in the known galaxy that had evolved for endurance hunting. The ability to chase prey not by outrunning it, but by simply never stopping. No other known spacefaring species hunted this way. It was considered, by most galactic biologists, an evolutionary oddity. Itho had a different interpretation. He wrote, "A species that evolved to outlast rather than overpower its prey has a fundamentally different relationship with time and suffering than a species that evolved to win quickly." The implications for conflict behavior are significant. Vrethen turned the page. The section on human pain tolerance and psychological endurance was clinical and careful and deeply uncomfortable to read. It cited military histories. It cited accounts of human soldiers who had continued to function after injuries that would have completely incapacitated members of most known species. It cited accounts of human prisoners of war who had survived conditions that, by physiological metrics, should have been lethal, and who had returned to their communities and rebuilt their lives. It was not that humans did not feel pain. It was that they had a relationship with pain that other species did not. Itho had written, most species, when subjected to extreme duress, will reach a threshold at which surrender or withdrawal becomes the dominant behavioral response. This is normal and healthy. It is the biological circuit breaker. Humans appear to have this circuit breaker, but in a significant percentage of individuals, under certain conditions of high enough personal or collective significance, the breaker does not trip. Vrethan set the report down again. He walked to the window. The gas giant was still there, still beautiful, still slowly turning. He picked the report back up. The section on nuclear deterrence was the one that made him sit down. The Council's Intelligence Division had initially flagged this as a threat indicator, which was why it had been noted in the original assessment. Humans had developed what they called nuclear weapons. Devices capable of rendering large portions of their planet uninhabitable. They had done this in the middle of one of their great wars and had used them twice before ceasing. Then several of their nations had built more of them. Many more. Enough to end all complex life on the planet multiple times over. The standard interpretation was, unstable species with self-termination capability, proceed with integration before capability expands. Itho's interpretation was different. Itho had spent 6 months reading everything the humans had written about their own deterrence theory. The documents were public. Humans had debated this openly, in academic journals, in political forums, in something called newspaper opinion columns. They had argued about it constantly for nearly a century. And then Itho had written one sentence that Vrethan read 4 times. It said, humans built weapons capable of ending their world, understood exactly what those weapons could do, and then chose not to use them. Not because they lacked the capability. Not because they lacked the motive. They chose not to use them because a faction of human thinkers developed a strategic framework that convinced enough decision-makers that not using the weapons was more powerful than using them. A species that could look at the most destructive capability it had ever built and say, the power is in not pulling the trigger. Vrethan had been in galactic politics for 60 years. He had negotiated treaties. He had managed conflicts. He had guided 3 civilizations through their integration into the council structure. He had never encountered anything like this. The final section of Itho's report was the shortest. It was titled, Note on the Military Capacity Assessment. Itho wrote, the standard assessment classified Earth's military capacity as negligible based on active warship count. I recommend revisiting this classification. The assessment did not account for the following: the number of functioning industrial facilities capable of rapid conversion to military production. The size of the human population with active or reserve military training. The documented human capacity to industrialize at extraordinary speed under perceived existential threat. During their Second Great War, a single human nation converted its entire civilian manufacturing base to military production within 18 months and outproduced every other nation in the conflict combined. We counted the ships, Itho wrote. We did not count the shipyards. Vrethan put the report face down on his desk. He looked at his Dathane glass. It was empty. He did not remember finishing it. He thought about Ambassador Cale Marin, sitting at that table yesterday, writing in that paper notebook, asking about fleet response times and political disputes between council members, and smiling the smile of a man who was not performing calm but who had somehow achieved it. Vrethan thought about the fact that Cale Marin had come here alone. He had thought that was weakness. Now he was beginning to think it was something else entirely. Something closer to the message a person sends when they walk into a room and do not bother to look for the exits. Not because they are foolish. Because they have already decided that no matter what happens in this room, they are going to walk out of it. Vrethan called his chief of staff. Postpone tomorrow's session, he said. I need to reread something. He pulled the report back toward him and opened it to the first page. This time, he read more slowly. The cruiser that pulled alongside my shuttle was called the Veth Dominion. It was, by my estimates, approximately 800 meters long. My shuttle was 11 meters long. I want to be very clear about those numbers, because I want you to understand what I was looking at when my proximity alert went off at 0340 station time. 11 meters. 800 meters. And the Veth Dominion was not alone. There were 12 of them. They came out of transit in a formation that had clearly been planned in advance. Not a patrol pattern. A surrounding pattern. The kind of formation you use when you want someone to understand that every direction they might consider moving has already been addressed. My co-pilot, a man named Oliver Gray who had been with me since the original deep space training program, looked at the formation for about 4 seconds. Then he said, "Kale." "I see them," I said. 12 of them. "Yes. We have one." "Oliver," I said, "I know how to count." The comm unit activated. The voice that came through was speaking Galactic Standard, and my translation earpiece rendered it in English. It belonged to a commander who identified himself as Veth Enforcement Commander Drath. He informed me that my vessel had been flagged for a routine inspection and resource declaration under Council Authority Clause 714. He told me to cut my drives and prepare for boarding. Clause 714. I had read every clause in the Galactic Council Charter before leaving Earth. Clause 714 was the provision that allowed enforcement officers to board and inventory the assets of a Tier 4 vessel. It was also, and this was the part they always left out of the polite version, the first legal step in the formal absorption process. Once your assets were declared, they became part of the planetary profile. Once the planetary profile was complete, the integration petition could be filed. It was not a routine inspection. It was a door. "Acknowledged," I said into the comm, "stand by." I cut my microphone. Oliver looked at me. He was 41 years old, from Bristol, had 2 children and a dog named Albert. He was the best pilot in the human deep space program and one of the steadiest people I had ever met. Even he looked slightly pale right now. "What are we doing?" he asked. "Opening a channel," I said. "Not to them." I pulled up the secondary comm panel. The one that was not on any manifest. The one that ran through the Q-band relay network, which was itself something that did not appear on any document I had ever submitted to the Galactic Council. For 18 months before I left Earth, while the diplomatic corps was visible about negotiating first contact protocol, another team had been invisible. Completely invisible. Their job had been simple in description and extraordinarily difficult in execution: seed the Council's territory with passive relay nodes. Disguised as debris. Disguised as ice fragments. Disguised as the natural scatter of a ship that had no particular reason to be leaving anything behind. The Q-band network was not a weapon. It was not a warship. It was not anything the Council's standard threat assessment would have flagged. It was a way of being heard when someone tried to make sure no one could hear you. I opened the channel. "This is Ambassador Marin," I said. "Authentication sequence November Foxtrot 77 Echo. Activating Q-band relay. I need a full intercept on DAL collective enforcement frequencies in this sector, and I need it now." There was a pause of about 9 seconds. Then a voice from Earth, distant and slightly distorted, said, "Authentication confirmed. Intercept active. You are live, Ambassador." Immediately, my earpiece filled with a second audio channel. It was the enforcement fleet's internal communications. I had been listening for 40 seconds when Commander Drath received an incoming transmission from the Council station. The voice on the other end was not calm. It was the voice of someone who had just been handed information that was not supposed to be possible and was still trying to process it. What they had found was this. For the past 11 months, quiet registrations had appeared in 17 different star systems. Not military registrations. Civilian registrations. Large vessels. Colony classification. Each one listed as an independent human settlement venture, filed under obscure galactic commerce law that allowed non-member species to establish provisional habitation rights in uncontested space. 17 vessels. Each one carrying approximately 100,000 people. Each one self-sufficient in food, energy, manufacturing, and governance for a minimum of 200 years. Each one positioned at a different star system, spread across a volume of space so large that no single coordinated action could touch more than 2 or 3 of them. Humanity had not been building a military. Humanity had not been building an empire. Humanity had been making itself impossible to end. It was the oldest answer in our history. When you cannot be sure of winning a fight, you make sure that no matter what happens to you, something survives to carry on. It was the logic of the seed vault, the backup drive, the letter written to someone not yet born. It was the logic that had kept human civilization going through every catastrophe it had ever faced. And we had applied it to the stars. I listened to the enforcement commander receive a second transmission. This one was from Vrethan himself. Vrethan's voice was very controlled. Very quiet. He said, "Stand down. Do not board that vessel. Do not engage that vessel. Do not communicate anything further to that vessel's crew until I have spoken to the ambassador directly." Drath said, "Sir, my orders were to proceed with the boarding protocol." Vrethan said, "Your orders have changed. Stand down." There was a pause. Drath said, "Understood." I closed the intercept channel. I opened my comm back to the enforcement fleet. "Commander Drath," I said. "This is Ambassador Marin. I believe we are done here. You may resume your patrol." There was a long silence. Then Drath said, "We are withdrawing. Safe transit, Ambassador." Oliver was looking at me. He had not heard the intercept. He had only heard my half of the conversation. He had watched me sit quietly for about 90 seconds while 12 warships surrounded us and then watched them leave. "What just happened?" he asked. "They checked something," I said. "And they found what we put there for them to find." Oliver was quiet for a moment. "The arcs," he said. "Yes." He let out a long breath. "And if they had not backed down? If they had boarded anyway?" I thought about that. I thought about 17 ships, each carrying 100,000 people, each one a complete civilization in miniature, each one already teaching its children and building its libraries and arguing about its politics and planting its gardens. Then they would have boarded a shuttle, I said. And humanity would have continued anyway. Oliver nodded slowly. "The ARC program was always the real mission," he said. It was not a question. The ARC program was always the real mission, I agreed. My job was just to make sure they discovered it at the right moment. I turned back to the navigation panel. The 12 cruisers were already gone, pulling away into the dark at speeds that would have seemed miraculous to my grandfather. They looked, from my window, very small. Oliver set a course back to the council station. We flew in silence for a while. Then he said, "Cale. When you were just sitting there, while 12 ships were surrounding us, what were you actually thinking about?" I considered the question. "My grandfather's garden," I said. He had this apple tree he planted when he was 22. He died at 87 and he never once saw it produce a full harvest, because the climate had shifted too much for apples in that part of Yorkshire. But he kept tending it anyway. Every year. Just in case. Oliver thought about that. "Did it ever produce anything?" "Once," I said. "The year after he died. My grandmother picked the apples and made a pie and she cried the entire time she was making it." The stars moved past the windows. Oliver did not say anything else for a while. Then he said, quietly, "We are something else, aren't we?" "Yes," I said. I did not mean it as pride. I meant it as fact. The assembly hall was exactly as I had left it. The same tiers of seats, the same cold blue light, the same weight of alien attention pressing down from every direction. Hundreds of species, thousands of years of shared history between them, all of them present for what was supposed to be a routine classification and integration proceeding. It was not a routine proceeding anymore. I could feel it the moment I walked in. The quality of the silence was different. It was not the silence of an audience waiting for a performance. It was the silence of a room that has already heard something and is still figuring out what it means. I took my seat at the diplomatic table. Vrethan was already in his chair at the head of the council tier. He looked at me the way he had looked at me in that first corridor, but with something different behind his eyes now. Not fear exactly. Recalculation. The look of a man updating a map he thought he already knew. He opened the session formally. He cited the relevant clauses. He noted that the previous day's events had prompted the council to request a revised agenda. Then he gave me the floor. I stood up. I did not use notes. "I want to tell you something about my grandmother," I said. No one in the room moved. She was born in 1951 in a small city in the north of England. When she was a child, there had just been a war that killed somewhere between 70 and 85 million people. Her father had been in it. He came home, which was not guaranteed, and he had a very hard time for many years. Her childhood was shaped by the shadow of that. By rationing and rebuilding in the slow, difficult work of a society trying to put itself back together. I paused. She became a schoolteacher. She taught for 41 years. She planted a garden every spring. She made pie from apples my grandfather grew even when the climate made that difficult. She read voraciously, argued freely, and laughed easily, and when she was 83 years old, she told me that the most important thing she had learned in her entire life was that the next generation would face things she could not imagine, and her job was to make sure they were ready. The hall was absolutely still. I tell you this, I said, not to make you feel sympathy for one human woman in a small English city. I tell you this because she was not unusual. She was ordinary. She was one of billions of ordinary human people who understood, without being taught it explicitly, that their life was connected to lives that had not happened yet. That the point of surviving was not just to continue existing but to continue building. I looked up at Vrethan. Your classification document describes Earth as a Tier 4 emerging species with characteristics that indicate instability. I want to address that characterization directly. You identified our history of internal conflict as a risk factor. You are not wrong that we have fought. We have fought more than almost any species in this hall. Our history carries more loss than I can express to you in the time I have been given. I let that sit. But I want to offer a different interpretation. Not to argue with your data. Your data is accurate. I want to argue with your framework. I reached into my jacket pocket. I took out my notebook. I opened it to a page near the front. There is a concept in human engineering called anti-fragility. It was named by a human thinker about a century ago, but the idea it describes is as old as we are. Anti-fragility is not strength. It is not resilience. Resilience means you can absorb a blow and return to what you were. Anti-fragility means the blow makes you more than you were. I looked around the hall. Every face was turned toward me. I had no way of reading most of them. But they were listening. A bone that heals after a fracture is stronger at the fracture point than it was before. A muscle that is worked to failure rebuilds denser than it was. An immune system that has encountered a pathogen builds a response it did not have before. These are biological examples. But the principle operates at the civilizational level too. I turned the page. Every catastrophe in our history that we survived, we came out of with something we did not have going in. Not always immediately. Sometimes it took generations. But the pattern holds. We have been practicing anti-fragility since before we were a species, because the environment that made us required it. We evolved on a planet that had seasons of abundance and seasons of scarcity. That had predators. That had disease. That had drought and flood and fire. We are the product of every generation that survived all of that and then turned around and taught the next generation how. I closed the notebook. Your analysts counted our warships. I understand why. Warships are the conventional index of military threat. But the question I would ask you to consider is not how many ships we have. The question is what kind of species builds a ship in the first place. I looked at Vrethan directly. We are the kind of species that looked at an empty sky and decided we needed to be out there. Not because anyone told us to. Not because the council invited us. Because we looked up and felt pulled. And then we built. And failed. And rebuilt. And lost people. And grieved. And kept building anyway. Because that is the only thing we have ever known how to do. A council member from the Varith coalition spoke up. I had learned his name was Sethan. He had been, according to my political profiles, one of the more skeptical voices regarding human admission. Ambassador Marin, he said, this is eloquent. But the council must base its decisions on capability assessments, not stories. I agree, I said. So let me give you a capability assessment. I reached into my briefcase and took out a single physical sheet of paper. I slid it across the diplomatic table toward the council's data relay, where a council aide picked it up. That is a list of 17 registered human vessels currently located in uncontested space across this sector of the galaxy. Each one is a self-sustaining colony. Each carries 100,000 people and manufacturing capacity sufficient to rebuild human civilization from zero. They are not military vessels. They carry no weapon systems whatsoever. They are simply there. I let that register. You cannot end us, I said. Not with threat in my voice. With simple accuracy. You could destroy Earth, which would be a catastrophe of unimaginable proportions and which I believe no one in this hall actually wants, and you would still not end us. We have already made sure of that. Not because we anticipated a conflict with the Council. Because we are the kind of species that makes sure, before anything else, that some part of us will continue. Sethan was quiet. The hall was quiet. I looked across all of them. I am not here to challenge the Council. I am not here to threaten it. I am not here to impress it, though I understand if some of what I have said has been surprising. I am here because I believe, and my government believes, that the decisions made in this hall affect my species whether or not we have a seat in it. And a species with our history and our nature and our particular relationship with difficulty is considerably more useful to you inside this structure than outside it. I paused. We have never been particularly good at staying outside things. Something happened in the hall then. It was not laughter exactly, but it was something adjacent to it, a release of tension, a subtle shift in atmosphere, as though the air had been holding something and had finally let it go. Vrethan looked at me for a long moment. Then he said something I had not expected. He said, "Ambassador, I reviewed a report last night about your species. A supplementary analysis. There was a line in it that I have not been able to stop thinking about." "What line?" I asked. "It said that in your darkest historical periods," he said slowly, as though he was reading it in his memory, "humans made art." The hall was still. "Yes," I said. "We did." "Why?" he asked. It was a genuine question. I could hear it. Not diplomatic maneuvering. Genuine bafflement and something close to wonder. "Because we are not just trying to survive," I said. "We are trying to say something. We have always been trying to say something. Every painting and song and building and story is a person saying, 'I was here.' This mattered. The world was strange and painful and beautiful and I felt it fully and I want you to know that I was here." The silence after that was different from all the previous silences. It was not the silence of calculation or evaluation. It was the silence of something being understood. Sethan of the Varith Coalition was the first to speak. His voice was quiet. "I would like to formally propose an amendment to the agenda," he said. "Specifically, the removal of the Tier 4 integration proceedings regarding Earth, and the opening of full membership discussions." 3 other council members seconded immediately. Vrethan looked at me. I looked back at him. He raised his hand and opened the vote. It has been 9 years. 9 years since I walked back out of that assembly hall into a corridor that was still cold and still blue-lit and still designed to make a visitor feel small, except that this time I was not a visitor anymore. I was a member. Earth was a member. Humanity had a seat at the table where the decisions were made. I want to tell you what those 9 years were actually like, because I suspect the version you have heard leaves out the parts that matter most. The first year was paperwork. An extraordinary amount of paperwork. Integration into galactic legal frameworks, trade codification, communications protocols, educational exchange agreements. There were humans who thought that joining the council would feel like an arrival. What it mostly felt like was the beginning of a very long process that would take generations to complete. I told that to my team at a briefing 3 months after admission and watched half of them struggle not to look disappointed. I told them what my grandmother would have said. She would have said, "Get on with it." So we got on with it. The council, it turned out, had a problem that no one talked about directly. It had existed so long, in its current form, that it had begun to calcify. Not in any single dramatic way. Gradually. The way anything calcifies that is not regularly challenged. Decisions took longer than they needed to. Species that had strong opinions kept them quiet because the social cost of disruption was high. The structures that were supposed to allow adaptation had themselves become resistant to change. Humans arrived and immediately began disrupting things. Not intentionally. Not as a strategy. Just because disruption was, apparently, our natural state. We proposed things. We asked why procedures were done in particular ways when they could be done in better ways. We formed informal relationships across species lines because we found other species genuinely interesting, which seemed to surprise many of them. We argued. We collaborated. We complained loudly when we thought something was inefficient and then, without waiting for permission, started trying to make it more efficient. The other species watched all of this with a mixture of exhaustion and fascination. I received a message from Sethan of the Varith Coalition about 18 months after admission. It was informal, which was unusual for him. He wrote, "Ambassador Marin, I have been reviewing Council productivity metrics from the past year. I do not know how to interpret them. Matters that had been unresolved for decades have been resolved. I do not know if your species caused this or simply coincided with it." I wrote back, "In our experience, there is rarely a clean answer to that question. We just keep showing up." He did not reply to that for 3 days. When he did, he said, "That may be the most human sentence I have encountered." In the second year, we had our first real test of whether admission had changed anything meaningful. A dispute arose between the Dal Collective and a smaller species called the Marith, who occupied a cluster of moons in what the Council designated as contested territory. The Marith had a population of about 40 million. The Dal Collective wanted mining rights to the primary moon, which was rich in the same rare minerals that made Earth attractive in the first place. The standard Council process for such a dispute was slow, formal, and heavily weighted toward the more powerful party. The Marith would have lost their moon within 2 years under the process. Probably peacefully. Probably with some form of compensation that looked reasonable on paper and was inadequate in practice. I spent 4 months on that case. I did not do it because Earth had any direct interest in the Marith moon dispute. I did it because I had read enough galactic history by then to understand that the way the Council treated its smallest members said something definitive about what kind of institution it was. And because, frankly, my grandmother would never have let me not do it. We got the Marith a 50-year non-extraction covenant on their primary moon with a review clause that required supermajority consensus to override. It was the strongest protection a small species had received in that category of dispute in 60 years. Vrethan called me after the decision came through. "You did not have to do that," he said. "No," I agreed. "It cost you political capital with 3 Dal Collective Council members." "Yes." "Why?" I thought about what to say. I thought about all the complicated true answers. I thought about the Marith children I had seen in a video transmission from their moon, playing some kind of game that involved throwing a round object at a marked surface, laughing in a frequency I could not hear but could see on their faces. "Because someone should," I said. And we were there. Vrethan was quiet for a moment. "Ambassador Marin," he said, "I want to ask you something that is outside my usual scope." "Ask," I said. "Are humans ever afraid?" I had not expected that question. I had expected strategic questions, political questions. Not that one. "Constantly," I said. And yet, I agreed. He was quiet for a long moment. "How?" he asked. "How do you continue when you are afraid?" I thought about that for a long time before answering. I thought about all the people in all the stories I had ever been told. The ones who had kept walking when walking seemed impossible. The ones who had kept building when everything they built kept falling. The ones who had planted trees they would never see grow. The ones who had written letters to people who did not exist yet. The ones who had made art in the middle of everything. "I do not think we know how to do anything else," I said. "I think we decided a very long time ago, not as a government or a culture but as a species, in the part of us that is deeper than language, that the answer to not knowing whether it will be okay is to act as though it will be. Not because we are certain. Because certainty was never the point." Vrethan did not say anything. "The point was always the trying," I said. We had dinner that evening. Vrethan and I, in a small room off the main diplomatic corridor, with food that he had ordered from 3 different species' kitchens because he was not sure what I would find edible and he had, as he put it, decided to cover the range. It was the first time I had seen him be uncertain about something small. It struck me as one of the most fundamentally decent things I had ever witnessed. All that power and history, and he had thought carefully about what a human might be able to eat. We talked for 4 hours. Not about politics. About things. He told me about his homeworld, which had a single enormous ocean and smelled like salt and iron in the rainy season. He told me about his family, which was structured in a way I could not entirely map onto human concepts of family but which clearly meant everything to him. He told me that he had entered politics because when he was young, a council decision had affected his family's region badly, and no one from his region had been in the room when the decision was made, and he had decided then that he would be in every room that mattered. I told him about Yorkshire. About the cold and the wind and my grandfather's apple tree and the pie my grandmother had made the year after my grandfather died. I told him about the heather on the moors in late summer and the way the light came down through clouds in long pale columns over the hills. He listened to all of it. At the end of the evening, as we were both preparing to leave, he paused at the door. "Ambassador Marin," he said, "when you first arrived at this station, I believed I understood what you were." "I know," I said. "I was wrong in the most fundamental possible way," he said. "Not about your capabilities. About your nature. I thought you were a small species that had arrived too early. I now think you are a species that arrived at exactly the right moment, because you are the kind of species that tends to arrive at exactly the right moment." I did not know what to say to that. The report I read, he continued, had a line about how humans make art in their darkest times. I have thought about that line many times since I read it. I think I now understand what it means. "What does it mean?" I asked. "It means you were never just trying to survive," he said. "You were always also trying to say something." He held the door open for me. After a moment, I walked through it. The corridor outside was still long, still curved, still lit in cold blue that pulsed very faintly, like something breathing. But it did not feel the way it had when I first walked it 9 years ago. It did not feel designed to make me small. It felt like a place where things happened. I walked through it the way I always walked through every corridor and every room and every difficult conversation and every moment when I was not sure what came next. I walked through it like there was somewhere to be on the other side. There always was. That is the thing about us. That has always been the thing about us. We have never learned how to stop walking toward the next thing. Not because we are fearless. Not because we are certain. But because somewhere in our oldest memory, before we had language for it, we understood that the distance between where you are and where you need to be does not care how tired you are. It only cares whether you keep moving. We always kept moving. That is why we are here. That is why we will still be here long after every star that watched us make our first hesitant steps into the dark has burned down to a quiet ember. Not because we are the strongest. Not because we are the smartest. Because we are the ones who, every single time without exception, looked at the end of everything they had ever known and said, "Right. What comes next?" And meant it.